when a group of men targets Loretta Johnson, a kind elderly black woman, with hateful remarks and threats in a park, they believe their actions will go unnoticed. However, their plan takes an unexpected turn when Loretta's son, Isaiah, a determined FBI agent, intervenes to protect her. What begins as a confrontation escalates into a battle for justice, exposing a history of racially motivated attacks by the men. As the courtroom drama unfolds, the emotional toll on Loretta and Isaiah reveals the deep impact of hate and the courage it takes to stand against it. Here is the story. The warm afternoon sun filtered through the towering oaks in Lincoln Park, casting golden specks of light across the winding pathways. Miriam Bennett, a dignified woman of 72, sat on a bench near the park's ornate fountain. She adjusted her straw hat and sighed, soaking in the tranquility of her favorite spot. The laughter of children playing nearby mingled with the soft rush of the fountain, creating a soothing backdrop. Miriam glanced at her watch. Her son, Dominic, had promised to meet her after his shift. He worked tirelessly as a federal investigator, and these weekly visits to the park were their cherished tradition. Though Dominic was often late, Miriam didn't mind. She enjoyed these peaceful moments, letting her thoughts wander. As she shifted to get comfortable, 3 men approached from the far end of the path. Their voices broke through the stillness, rough and mocking. They stood out from the usual park-goers, their movements too calculated, their laughter carrying an edge that didn't belong in such a serene setting. Dressed in torn jeans and dusty boots, they exuded trouble. Miriam's chest tightened as they turned their attention toward her. "Hey there, miss," the tallest of the group called out with a sneer, his wiry frame leaning forward as though trying to corner her with his gaze. "Enjoying the park all by yourself?" Miriam's instinct was to ignore them. Her fingers curled around her purse as she forced herself to focus on the fountain's gentle flow. "Not much of a talker, huh?" another man added, stockier with a smirk that mirrored the first. "We're just being friendly." "I'm fine, thank you," Miriam replied, her voice even but clipped. Her eyes scanned the park, hoping to spot Dominic walking toward her. The men exchanged amused glances before closing the distance. The stocky man nudged the smallest of the group, who chuckled and said, "You know, this ain't really your kind of place. Maybe you'd feel more comfortable somewhere else." Miriam stiffened, but kept her composure. "I've been coming to this park for years. I'm perfectly comfortable, thank you." "Is that so?" the wiry man replied, leaning on the back of her bench. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Funny, because it doesn't look like you belong here." Miriam's heart began to race, but she refused to let fear dictate her response. "Everyone has the right to enjoy the park," she said firmly, meeting his gaze. The wiry man's grin widened. "Oh, we're talking about rights now. Look at you, all brave and proper. But rights don't mean much when no one's around to hear you scream." The stocky man stepped closer, kicking at the edge of the bench. "You're awful confident for someone sitting alone. Where's that son you keep looking for, huh?" Miriam's grip on her purse tightened. "He'll be here soon," she said steadily, though unease crept into her voice. "Oh, sure," the smaller man jeered. "Bet he's a real tough guy, right? Going to come save you?" "Maybe you should stop waiting," the wiry man added, his tone cold. "No one's coming. Let's not waste anyone's time. Just hand over that purse and that necklace while you're at it." Miriam's fingers brushed the delicate pendant around her neck, a simple gold chain with a locket holding a photo of her late husband. "You can't have it," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "Oh, we'll see about that," the wiry man sneered. He reached out, but Miriam shifted back, her movements sharp and defiant. "Touch me again and you'll regret it," she warned. The stocky man laughed, a cruel, hollow sound. "Regret it? What are you going to do, Grandma?" Before Miriam could respond, a deep voice rang out from behind the men. "She doesn't have to do anything, I'm here now." The 3 men turned to see Dominic Bennett standing at the edge of the path. He was tall, with broad shoulders and a quiet intensity that immediately commanded attention. His dark eyes locked onto the men, his posture both calm and intimidating. The wiry man's smirk faltered. "And who are you supposed to be?" he sneered, though his confidence wavered under Dominic's glare. Dominic took a step closer. "I'm her son," he said evenly, his voice laced with restrained anger. "And you're going to walk away now." The stocky man crossed his arms, puffing out his chest. "Or what you think you're going to stop us? There's 3 of us and 1 of you." Dominic's expression didn't change. He took another step forward, his tone deadly calm. "Try me." The tension thickened, the air heavy with unspoken threats. The wiry man glanced at his companions, his bravado slipping as Dominic's presence loomed larger. "This isn't over." The wiry man spat, backing away reluctantly. He motioned for the others to follow. The stocky man hesitated, but eventually turned, muttering under his breath. Dominic didn't move until they were out of sight. Only then did he crouch beside his mother, his voice softening. "Are you okay, Mom?" Miriam nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched her locket. "I'm fine now," she said, her voice steadying. "Thanks to you." Dominic's jaw tightened as he glanced down the path where the men had disappeared. They won't get far, he said, his tone resolute. Not while I'm here. Isaiah's voice carried a quiet command as he approached Gary, whose panic was evident. Gary's chair screeched against the worn floor as he scrambled to his feet, knocking over his beer in the process. No, 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 he muttered, backing away like a cornered animal. The dimly lit bar, with its haze of cigarette smoke and faint clinking of glasses, fell silent as patrons turned their attention to the scene unfolding in the far corner. Isaiah's calm demeanor belied the storm brewing beneath the surface as he closed the gap between them. It's over, Gary, Isaiah said firmly, his eyes locked on the trembling man. Don't make this worse than it already is. Gary raised his hands defensively, his breathing quick and uneven. I didn't do anything, he exclaimed, his voice cracking. This wasn't me, it was Paul, he's the one you want. Isaiah's gaze didn't waver. Paul and Troy are already in custody, he said evenly, his tone sharp with finality. You're the last one, sit down, and we'll settle this. Gary's eyes darted toward the bar's back exit. His movements were twitchy, his fear palpable. I'm not going anywhere with you, he hissed, edging toward the door. The bartender, polishing a glass, watched from a safe distance, while a few patrons whispered among themselves. Gary, Isaiah warned, his voice calm but carrying a weight that stilled the air. You don't have a choice. We can do this the easy way or the hard way. Gary froze for a moment, his gaze flicking between Isaiah and the exit, before pure desperation took over. With a burst of energy, he shoved a nearby table toward Isaiah, sending glasses and bottles crashing to the floor. Stay back, he shouted, bolting toward the back door. Isaiah moved with precision, sidestepping the table and immediately breaking into a sprint after Gary. His voice echoed through the smoky room. Stop, Gary. The bar patrons scattered, some pressing against the walls while others hurried to get out of the way. The chase spilled into the narrow alley behind the building, where the cold night air hit Isaiah's face. The sound of Gary's frantic footsteps echoed in the confined space. Gary, Isaiah shouted, his tone sharp enough to slice through the chaos. You're not getting away. Stop now. Gary glanced over his shoulder, his face a mix of fear and defiance. Leave me alone, he yelled, his voice breaking under the weight of his desperation. He turned sharply, darting around a dumpster, nearly tripping over a stack of crates. Isaiah's training kicked in, his strides precise and calculated. He closed the distance with ease, his breathing steady despite the exertion. With a final push, Isaiah lunged forward, grabbing the back of Gary's jacket and yanking him to the ground. Gary let out a panicked cry as they tumbled onto the asphalt. He thrashed and kicked, his hands clawing at Isaiah in a desperate attempt to escape. Get off me, he screamed, his voice tinged with fear. Isaiah pinned Gary's arms with practiced efficiency, his grip unyielding. You're done, Gary, he said, his voice calm but cold. This is over. Gary's struggling slowed as he realized he couldn't break free. His chest heaved as he glared up at Isaiah. You can't do this, he spat, his voice shaking. You don't have the right. Isaiah leaned in slightly, his gaze unflinching. I have every right. You and your friends made sure of that. The sound of tires screeching to a stop at the alley's entrance drew both their attention. A patrol car's flashing lights illuminated the narrow space as two officers stepped out, their hands hovering near their holstered weapons. They moved quickly toward Isaiah and Gary, taking in the scene with practiced eyes. Isaiah stood, pulling Gary to his feet and holding him firmly by the arm. This is your man, he said to the officers, his voice steady. Wanted for assault, robbery, and fleeing arrest. The officers exchanged a brief nod before stepping forward to cuff Gary, whose shoulders slumped in defeat. His bravado was gone, replaced by the realization that he had nowhere left to run. You're making a mistake, Gary muttered weakly as the cuffs snapped around his wrists. This wasn't my idea. It was all Paul's and Troy's. Isaiah's expression hardened as he stepped back, letting the officers take control. You'll have plenty of time to explain that, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. As the officers guided Gary toward the patrol car, Isaiah took a deep breath, his adrenaline beginning to wane. The night air was quiet now, save for the faint hum of the car's engine. Gary's protests faded as he was placed in the back seat, the door slamming shut with a finality that marked the end of the chase. Isaiah watched the car pull away, his mind already shifting to the next steps justice had been served for now, but he knew the ripple effects of that day in the park were far from over. He turned back toward his car, his jaw set with quiet determination. This wasn't just about catching criminals. It was about sending a message that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequences. As he slid into the driver's seat and started the engine, Isaiah allowed himself a brief moment of reflection. His mother's safety had been his first priority, and now that she was out of harm's way, he could focus on ensuring that the men responsible faced the full weight of the law. For Isaiah, the fight wasn't just about his mother. It was about standing against those who thought they could act without accountability, and as long as he had the strength to do so, he wouldn't stop fighting. Isaiah's eyes softened as he reached across the table to place his hand over his mother's. You won't freeze, Mom, he said gently. You've already faced them at their worst. This is about standing tall and showing the world what they did. You've got this." Loretta nodded slowly, though the unease in her eyes lingered. "I've always believed that staying quiet was the safest option," she admitted, her voice tinged with years of restrained pain. "But this time I can't. Not after what they tried to do." Isaiah gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "You're not alone in this. I'll be right there with you, and so will Melanie. All you need to do is tell the truth. The evidence will back you up." Her fingers tightened around her mug. "It's not just for me," she said softly. "It's for every person they've hurt, every family they've made feel small. They need to know their hate can't win." Isaiah smiled faintly, admiration shining in his eyes. "That's why I'm proud of you, Mom. You're showing them exactly who they underestimated." They spent the rest of the evening practicing her testimony. Isaiah asked her questions similar to what the defense might throw her way, preparing her for every possible angle. Loretta's voice grew stronger with each answer, her confidence building. By the time they finished, she straightened her back and said with quiet determination, "Let them come. I'm ready." The courtroom buzzed with muted conversations as people filed into their seats, anticipation thick in the air. Isaiah sat beside Melanie at the prosecution's table, his expression calm but intense. Across the room, Paul, Troy, and Gary sat with their defense team. Paul's smirk was gone, replaced by a defiant scowl. Troy looked pale and anxious, while Gary avoided everyone's gaze, fidgeting nervously. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, and the trial began. Melanie's opening statement was sharp and to the point, laying out the trio's pattern of targeted harassment and racially motivated attacks. "This isn't just about one incident," she told the jury. "This is about a deliberate campaign of hate and intimidation. The defendants didn't just act with malice, they acted with purpose." The defense attempted to downplay the accusations, portraying the trio as misunderstood men whose actions were exaggerated. Paul's lawyer, a sharp-tongued man in a tailored suit, leaned heavily on the argument that emotions had run high that day, and the situation had spiraled out of control. Isaiah clenched his jaw but kept his composure. He knew the evidence would speak louder than any excuses the defense could muster. When Loretta took the stand, the room seemed to hold its breath. She sat tall, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her voice steady as she recounted the events in the park. Her words painted a vivid picture of the trio's intimidation, the insults they hurled, and the way they surrounded her like predators. "They thought I was alone," she said firmly, her gaze unwavering as she looked at the jury. "They thought no one would care what happened to me." The defense attorney rose, his tone sharp but calculated. "Mrs. Johnson, isn't it true that you've had run-ins with people in the park before? Perhaps this was just a misunderstanding?" Loretta's eyes narrowed slightly. "A misunderstanding doesn't leave you pinned to a bench, fearing for your life." The attorney pressed on, trying to rattle her. "You say you felt threatened, but isn't it possible you misinterpreted their intentions?" Loretta's voice grew stronger, each word precise. "When someone grabs your purse and tells you that you don't belong, there's no misinterpreting their intentions." The jury watched intently as she continued to hold her ground, deflecting each of the defense's attempts to discredit her. By the time she stepped down from the stand, her quiet strength had left a lasting impression. Over the following days, the prosecution built an airtight case. Witness after witness described incidents involving the trio, vandalism, harassment, and violent confrontations, all carrying the same thread of hate. Surveillance footage was played, showing Paul's brazen acts of aggression, Gary's role as the enforcer, and Troy's feigned reluctance while still participating. Troy's testimony was a turning point. Under pressure from Melanie's questioning, he admitted to following Paul's lead. "Paul said they didn't belong," he mumbled, his voice breaking. "He said we had to teach them a lesson." The courtroom fell silent as those words hung in the air. It was the damning admission the prosecution needed to solidify their case. When it was Paul's turn to testify, he tried to maintain his defiance, claiming that everything had been blown out of proportion. But Melanie was relentless, dismantling his arguments piece by piece. "You say it wasn't planned," she said, holding up a series of texts between the trio. "Then why did you send this message to Troy and Gary 2 days before the incident saying, 'Let's show them what happens when they forget their place'?" Paul's face darkened, but he remained silent. "And these victims?" Melanie continued, gesturing to the gallery where several of the trio's previous targets sat. "Were they all misunderstandings too?" Paul's defiance faltered under the weight of the evidence, his silence speaking louder than any denial could. When the trial concluded, Isaiah sat beside Loretta, his hand resting protectively on hers as they waited for the verdict. The jury returned swiftly, their expressions resolute. The foreperson stood, clearing her throat. "On the charges of aggravated assault, hate crimes, and conspiracy, we find the defendants guilty." A ripple of relief and quiet murmurs spread through the room. Paul slumped in his seat, his bravado completely shattered. Troy looked as though the weight of the world had collapsed on him, and Gary buried his face in his hands. Isaiah turned to his mother, A small but genuine smile breaking through his stern expression, Loretta exhaled deeply, her hand trembling slightly as she squeezed his. "We did it," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "No, Mom," Isaiah said, his voice steady. "You did it." As they left the courthouse, reporters swarmed them, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Isaiah shielded his mother, keeping his responses brief. "Justice was served," he said simply. "But the fight doesn't stop here." Later, back at Loretta's home, they sat together in the living room, the tension of the trial finally easing. The sun set outside, casting a warm glow through the curtains. Loretta looked at her son, pride and gratitude shining in her eyes. "You've always been my strength, Isaiah," she said softly. Isaiah shook his head, smiling. "No, Mom. This time, you were mine." The journey had been long and grueling, but they had stood together against hate and won. Though the scars of the ordeal would linger, they both knew they had made a difference, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. And that, Isaiah thought as he glanced at his mother, was a victory worth fighting for. Loretta's hands trembled slightly as she held the warm tea mug, her gaze distant as if replaying the events of the trial. Isaiah sat beside her on the porch, his quiet presence grounding her. The setting sun painted the yard in shades of amber, casting a tranquil glow over the moment. "They're gone now," Loretta said softly, her voice carrying both relief and lingering pain. "Locked away where they can't hurt anyone else." Isaiah nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "It doesn't undo what they've done," he said, his tone steady. "But it stops them from doing it again. And that matters." Loretta let out a long, measured breath. "You know," she began, her voice quieter, "I've carried this kind of hate with me my entire life. Not my own hate, but the hate of others. I've ignored it, brushed it off, told myself it wasn't worth fighting. But standing up in that courtroom..." She paused, the faintest hint of a smile touching her lips. "It felt like I wasn't just fighting for me. I was standing up for everyone who's ever felt small, scared, or powerless." Isaiah turned to her, admiration shining in his eyes. "You were incredible, Mom," he said. "You didn't just stand up for yourself. You showed them what true strength looks like. You showed everyone in that room that silence isn't the only way to survive." Loretta sipped her tea, her hands steady now, and nodded. "And you," she said, turning her gaze toward her son. "You've been my anchor through all of this. I couldn't have done it without you." Isaiah smiled faintly, leaning back in his chair. "We did it together, Mom, and because of you, someone else might have the courage to stand up the next time." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the past weeks gradually lifting. The air around them was still, punctuated only by the faint chirping of crickets and the rustling of leaves. For the first time in what felt like ages, the world seemed peaceful. The trial had left an indelible mark on both of them. The defendants, Paul, Troy, and Gary, had received their sentences, but the road to justice had been grueling. Isaiah's work alongside Melanie Carter, the relentless prosecutor, had ensured their guilt was proven beyond a shadow of a doubt. Still, the scars of their actions lingered. Paul's arrogant smirk had disappeared as the guilty verdict was read. His sentence, 18 years without parole, was a stark reminder of the consequences of his hatred. Troy's cooperation had earned him some leniency, though his 15-year sentence left him pale and shaken. Gary, the quiet follower, had received 12 years, his regret visible but not enough to absolve him. Outside the courthouse that day, reporters had clamored for statements, but Isaiah and Loretta had quietly slipped away, choosing to leave the chaos behind. For them, the true victory wasn't in the public spectacle. It was in knowing they had stood their ground and demanded accountability. The days after the trial brought a much-needed stillness. Isaiah buried himself in his work at the precinct, determined to use the momentum of the case to address other injustices. Loretta, meanwhile, spent her time reconnecting with friends and neighbors, many of whom had reached out with messages of support after hearing her story. One evening, Isaiah came home to find Loretta seated at the kitchen table, a stack of letters in front of her. She gestured for him to sit, her expression a mix of surprise and warmth. "These," she said, motioning to the letters, "are from people who saw the trial or read about it. Some are from complete strangers." Isaiah picked up one of the letters, scanning its contents. It was from a young woman who described her own experiences with harassment and how Loretta's courage had inspired her to speak out. "She said you gave her hope," Isaiah murmured, his voice soft with awe. "Mom, you've done more than just fight for yourself. You've shown people that it's possible to fight back and win." Loretta smiled, her eyes glistening. "It wasn't just me," she said. "It was us. And it's not over, Isaiah. There's still so much to do." Isaiah nodded, setting the letter down and meeting her gaze. "Then we'll keep fighting," he said. "Together." Months later, the case had sparked a broader conversation in their community about accountability and the insidious nature of hate. Loretta was invited to speak at local events, sharing her story and encouraging others to stand against injustice. Isaiah often stood in the back at these gatherings, watching his mother command the room with quiet strength and unwavering conviction. One evening, after Loretta had finished addressing a packed community center, a young man approached her. His voice trembled as he spoke. "Mrs. Johnson, my grandmother went through something similar years ago. She was too scared to say anything. Watching you stand up to those men, it's given my family so much hope." "Thank you." Loretta placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, her smile kind but firm. "The fight isn't just mine," she said. "It's all of ours. And together, we can make sure that hate doesn't have the last word." Back on the porch, under a sky scattered with stars, Loretta and Isaiah sat together once more. The weight of their journey was still there, but it had lightened, replaced by a sense of purpose. "Do you think it'll ever change?" Loretta asked quietly, her gaze on the distant horizon. Isaiah was silent for a moment before answering. "It already is," he said. "Because of people like you." Loretta reached over, her hand resting gently on his. "And because of people like you, Isaiah." In the stillness of the night, mother and son shared a quiet resolve. The fight for justice wasn't over, but they knew they had the strength to face whatever came next, together.